Okay, everybody, welcome. Thank you for coming. Welcome to Sites on Earth with Sophia Roosth, Yasmina El Chami, who is going to appear on the screen, and Spyros Papapetros. I'm Lucia Lice. I'm the director of the Bureau. Before we begin, one reminder. On November 20th, we will be hosting a talk by Alexander Wood as part of our Before You Were Here project. The Before You Were Here project revisits the history of the campus's land, as seen from Columbia's oldest surviving building, the Bureau Hall, which is this one. Working backwards to the Bloomingdale Asylum, the gentleman's farm that preceded the campus, also to the Lenape who tended to the site's ecology, such as this, our reconstruction of the site's ecology circa 1625, all the way to the Ice Age, which shaped the rock beneath. And today that's I'm especially proud to be able to say that sentence with Sophia in the room. Wood will present the later part of that history, part of his research from the book Building the Metropolis, about construction and labor relations in New York City, and Jonah Rowan will be our respondent. Today's event is part of the Abundance Talks, which started 2 years ago to address the role that architecture plays in the promise of landed abundance in the American imagination, the promise of access to nature's endlessness, and the guarantees that were attached to that promise, guarantees of political freedom, economic opportunity, and if you've read the newspaper today, you can see that the word abundance continues to be used as a way to promise such things. The topic of today's talk is the siting or emplacement of humanity on Earth, and the outsized role that knowledge production plays in transforming the sites that it purports to study. And just to make the connection to the 19th century American imagination that gave rise to the Abundance Project, when missionaries, as you'll hear today, used architecture of American campuses to locate the Middle East in various narratives, they echoed the agricultural experiments that were being done in the long 19th century in America, such as here in California, where this lady is learning to till the land. Or when geobiologists, which we hear about today as well, repeatedly visit certain sites in search of microfossils, naming formations as sleeping giants and the like, they're repeating the monumentalizing gestures that were also made in the United States. For example, when national parks are made, they're gridded, indigenous people are removed, and their sites are renamed things like Devil's Tower. So, and then what I'm especially excited about with these talks today, as you'll hear, there's some methodological diversity in the talks today. But one of the things that's exciting about them is that they also help us think about recent problems in architectural historiography. So, as of about 2 decades ago, maybe a decade and a half ago, the way to question the universalism of modernism or of empire and the kind of tendency for architecture to spread isomorphically through space was to talk about place as something unique that elicited a kind of sense of belonging, or better yet, a sense of pride. And today's talks, I think, reveal that places are deeply fabricated, sometimes literally deeply, but also propose ways to rethink the stickiness of the concept of site specificity in place. So, we'll first hear from Yasmina El Chami, who is an architect and lecturer at the University of Sheffield. Her work focuses on informal and covert imperial actors in the 19th and early 20th century Middle East. Her writings have appeared everywhere. She's a very prolific and wonderful writer, and she's also a general editor of Architectural Histories, the AHN journal. Our second speaker will be Sophia Roosth, who's an anthropologist who writes about the contemporary life and earth sciences. She's the author of Synthetic: How Life Got Made, which is an ethnography of synthetic biologists in a post-genomic age. Her next book, amazingly called The Quick and the Dead, which from today's talk
My editor doesn't like it.
Oh, really? Oh, no longer to be called that, so enjoy it now. Immerses us in the worlds of contemporary geobiologists, who are scientists looking for ancient microbial life in fossilized stone. Is that right?
Yes.
And our respondent today will be my friend and colleague, former colleague, Spyros Papapetros, professor at Princeton in many departments. I'm not going to name them all. He's the author of On the Animation of the Inorganic. He's the co-editor of the first edition of Magic Architecture by Friedrich Chrysler, and the most recent project is the exhibition Pre-Architectures at SIVA in Brussels. So please join me in welcoming, please, Yasmina El Chami.
So I wanted to start with this anecdote, and I'm not going to read it out entirely, but the point of the anecdote is that, it's about how this impulse to plant a seminary in the barrens or a garden in the wilderness was really central to what the historian George Williams calls the wilderness motif. And in his opinion, it exceeded the significance of the frontier in both American history and church history in general. And I wanted to start with this anecdote because it suggests not only the centrality of the wilderness motif, but for me, but for the purposes of this talk, it also shows the role of missionaries in the advancement of the American frontier, the expansionist impulse in Protestant theology and thought, but also the complex role of land, which acts simultaneously as the natural setting within which the metaphorical garden is built, but also the site of the raw materials with which the missionary turned woodman fashions his enclosure. And so the garden is constructed out of the very wilderness that it aims to tame, and it ultimately has to destroy it. And in this talk, I wanted to return to this anecdote to talk about these linked ideas of wilderness and civilization, construction and destruction, and to talk about how theological and environmental myths of abundance have shaped the establishment and development of a series of American colleges in the area that the Americans called, after the First World War and around the turn of the century, the Near East. So scholars have written about the rise of US developmentalism, and they've hinted to its genealogical roots in missionary movements. But I think that they haven't really paid enough attention to the religious foundations of the meaning of mission, which I'm trying to argue are central to understanding the specific shape and character of US developmentalism and America's global role since the early 20th century. And several themes are central to the story of US's rise to global power that are quite well defined in the literature. Technological supremacy, the development of industrialism as the marker of US exceptionalism, and how that supremacy was deployed in developmental discourses. But also how in areas like the Middle East, or more specifically the Arab Gulf, the desert was cast as desolate and unproductive within discursive environmental imaginaries, while US technology was cast as the primary tool with which to make the environment productive again. By the way, sorry, but I don't seem to be able to advance the slides.
Okay, just say the word next and I'll do it. Tell me.
Next. And all of these are relevant to the talk and they form part of the story, but what these narratives are still missing is the theological dimension. And so in this talk, I wanted to focus on the 20th century iteration of what begins as a missionary project to show how the theological dimensions become and transform into more modern and liberal ideas. Next. So one, the garden in the wilderness, the colonial college. The primary site for the materialization of these American myths of abundance was the American College, which was central also to the development of the American nation itself since the early beginnings. So for the early Puritan colonists who had come to the New World to flee persecution in post-Reformation Europe, North America had represented a providential wilderness, which they had passed through in their exile and from which they'd grown their new settlements. So this was kind of the myth of Exodus. According to the church historian Williams, the colonial American college had been articulated around 5 themes, which were kind of derived from this story, but 2 of which are significant here. So first, although man's original sin impaired his reason, the university as a community of scholars would strive through self-discipline and integration of faith and reason to rectify the error of primal man. As such, the university was a garden cleared from the wilderness. End quote. Second, the university was, quote, an encampment of the militia of Christ. To redeem themselves, scholars would have to engage in discipline as a special kind of spiritual warfare, end quote. And next, sorry. From these themes, college campuses had derived their spatial composition in the colonial period. So the colonial college had been central to the settlement of new period towns. Its physical limits portended the growth of an adjacent community. Within its bounds, it was to constitute a campus, literally field from the Latin campus martius, which is the fighting field. And at its center was a green, a representation of this paradisiacal garden of final redemption. And as the US grew west, absorbing indigenous territories, the campus had also embodied the frontier, the space in which indigenous racialized others might be reformed and transformed at the edge of the so-called civilized garden, and either successfully incorporated or discarded. So the missionary college, both within the United States and overseas, was the garden through which the uncivilized body of the native would have to pass to learn the so-called advantages of civilization, or in evangelical terms, to absorb the learning of the Bible. Next, please. The Levant and Palestine and Lebanon had been one of the first regions to which ABCFM missionaries, so ABCFM was the largest missionary organization in the 19th century, had sailed to in 1820, only 10 years after the creation of this missionary organization. And for the early missionaries, the area surrounding Jerusalem was a moral and theophysical desert, inhabited by nominal Christians and Muslims and desperately in need of religious renovation. Following the First World War, these discourses, the discourses surrounding liberal evangelical education in the post-Ottoman Mediterranean would expand on this theme. And World War I was seen as confirmation of the East's moral degeneration and stagnation. But as part of this millenarian narrative, it was also a reflection that the punitive period, which would herald a new period of revival and renovation, was there. So it had kind of a double meaning. Next, please. In 1920, 5 missionary colleges that had been founded by the ABCFM in the 19th century, and those were the American University of Beirut, Robert College, and the Constantinople's Women's College in Istanbul, Sophia American College, International College of Smyrna, were gathered under the umbrella of something called the Near East College Association, which is a new organization that was founded by Cleveland Dodge. And in addition to these 5 existing colleges, in 1925, NECA spearheaded the creation of a new American college in Athens, founded in 1925. Next, please. So, number 2, cultivating an economic gospel, gardens in a desert of discord. So the missionary and theological underpinnings of this pseudo-secular project were clear in the way in which NECA framed donation campaigns and publications aimed at its American evangelical public. Next, please. The reasons why America should interest itself in the education of the East, according to these publications, were twofold. Firstly, the East had been the birthplace of education. Here, the science of mathematics, the knowledge of the humanities, foundations of education flourished and have done much in the past to enrich the thought of the world. Secondly, above education and greater than all is the spiritual life which was cradled in the East. These 2 great truths, education and religion, are the foundation of America's prosperity. How better can America, out of her abundance, repay her debt to the East? Next, please. So NECA's project was framed as, quote, an investment in international goodwill, end quote, which was no longer to be achieved through direct proselytism and missionary education, but through pseudo-secular liberal educational programs. From 6 stations in the Eastern Mediterranean, American educational institutions, once established by missionaries, would now broadcast international goodwill in the East. In this 20th century iteration, the American campus would not be a garden or seedbed for the propagation of new clergy, but rather a seedbed for the propagation of a new gospel of economic progress and industrial capitalism. And peace and goodwill would now be achieved through economic prosperity, just as they had in North America, according to the narrative. And the rehabilitation of post-Ottoman new independent nations would be achieved through American education and technological expertise. Next, please. The Near East was of particular importance to this narrative of world peace, according to NECA publications, chiefly because of its racial antipathies and national cross-currents, and the fact that due to being, quote, a hotbed of religious feeling, the Near East today presents to statesmen a problem of even more serious menace to the peace of the world than do the Balkans, end quote. Next, please. So NECA's American colleges were to act as, quote, cases of peace in a desert of discord, end quote. To reflect this so-called American spirit of democracy and goodwill, the campuses were, quote, to become a sort of neutral zone whose influence not only governs the student during his college career, but remains with him for life. In these neutral zones, or gardens in a desert of discord, religious and ethnic divisions, which missionaries had reinforced throughout the 19th century, would now be set aside as students came together to work towards a US vision of a world led by industry, trade, and economic growth. As argued by the American University of Beirut president of that period, Bayard Dodge, in a piece titled Education, a Vital Factor in Economic Reconstruction, the new, quote, practical type of American education was a timely means of reconstructing the economic life of the Near East, thereby making an estimable contribution to stabilizing conditions throughout the world, end quote. Next, please. Still, each college had a specific role to play within this broader regional project for a peaceful Near East. The colleges in Bulgaria and Greece, for example, provided the opportunity of reestablishing the campuses in new sites. This was not only because the existing missionary establishments had been relatively humble, but also because post-war conditions in these countries had led to specific socioeconomic conditions. Both countries had seen a large influx of refugees from Turkey throughout the First World War, and the new states' policies, with significant input from the League of Nations and American experts, had emphasized the prioritization of farming refugees and those willing to work in agriculture. So both colleges turned towards rural development and agricultural programs that would provide a new economic sector for these countries. Next, please. Large tracts of land were secured in Athens and in Sophia, enlisting the help of the two nations' governments and foreshadowing later models of development aid. Next, please. In Bulgaria, the existing school had been a small village school in the rural outskirts of Sofia. The new campus instead was built closer to the capital, although still in a rural location, with the government donating 15,000 cubic meters of timber from the government's forests to be used for constructing the campus. Next, please. At the edge of the new site of 100 acres outside the capital, the government's Department of Forestry also planted, quote, choice trees to make it a park of beauty, end quote. Next, please. So while the mid-19th century colleges, the Syrian Person College, the American University of Beirut, and Robert College had been established near large urban centers of the Ottoman Empire, adopting the 19th century spatial paradigm of the college on the hill, the new campuses funded by NECA, especially those in Athens and Sofia, situated in these rural areas, returned more forcefully to this image of the garden in the barrens. Next, please. That they may have life and have it more abundantly. Next, please. But NECA's campuses were not meant to act simply as an enclosure or a garden, but also as a gateway to enlightenment, a transitional space through which students would need to pass to become productive and internationally minded citizens. As in the opening anecdote, the campus was both the garden and the raw material from which it was constructed. As one NECA professor put it, quote, the college accepts the raw material, which comes from many medieval communities, and must mold that material so that it can be of use in the modern world, end quote. So the students were the raw material, but their ultimate destination was the world outside the campus, not within. The campus, in that sense, was merely a rehearsal space for future citizens and, on a larger scale, a laboratory for the nation around it. Next, please. The spaces in the new buildings constructed within NECA's campuses disclosed these experimental and didactic functions. The college's practical education was meant to act as a direct passage into economic prosperity and a productive future. And the best and easiest way to ensure this relationship was through staging education as a rehearsal for future professional life. So, for example, at the International College in Smyrna, which eventually became part of Turkey, and later in Beirut, quote, "The aim of the farm management course was to interest rich boys in agriculture rather than to unfit peasant boys for country life," end quote. So only sons of rich landowners were allowed into the course. Next, please. In rural locations around the campuses in Istanbul, Sofia, Athens, and the Bekaa Valley north of Lebanon, experimental farmland was acquired in which students in the agricultural courses would spend periods of time doing hands-on training. The fields acquired in existing agricultural areas were meant also to showcase the superiority of American methods and education, highlighting, quote, "the difference between work done by scientific culture on our fields and unscientific on fields nearby," thereby reinforcing the relevance of this new American education. Next, please. As described in one NECA publication, the change from a desert-looking waste to fruitful fields, which the one picture presents, shows what we're aiming at for the villages of Macedonia. The building of our brick barn illustrates what we attempt in the masonry department, and the bright faces of our boys showing their purpose and ability to accomplish things is, we believe, a revelation of what can be done for the rural life in Macedonia when we are equipped with means for carrying on demonstration work in the villages. So as implied in this description of the farm school outside Athens, the buildings and their construction were also part of this training. This was the case across all programs and not just those focused on technical education. Next, please. At Robert College and the American University, long-established colleges with large bodies of elite students across several programs, agriculture and engineering were simply added to existing degrees in medicine, literature, and the arts. But whereas the early buildings at AUB and Robert College had been built as exhibits of the US's superior technical and industrial knowledge, with materials imported at great expense from the US, the new buildings that were added in this period were conceived more as didactic tools that would inculcate this knowledge in local students and workers and embed it locally. So according to a report on the new medical buildings at AUB, quote, "The most striking thing about the new buildings is the fact that they have been built with great economy and a large amount of the furnishings have been made locally. Furthermore, the buildings exhibit to students and their friends how local materials and workmanship can be employed so as to produce results of the most modern type at minimum expense." A condition of the building's funding, which was donated by the Rockefeller Foundation, was that the scholarship students contribute to the construction of the buildings, illustrating how this new model of education was to embed new hierarchies and notions of dependence in this new class of students. Next, please. In Istanbul, to reinforce the notion that Turkey was undergoing, quote, "a new renaissance," end quote, a new library was built at Robert College, which provided both a symbolic addition to the campus and a very practical means to demonstrate NECA's new ideals. According to another publication, the materials needed for the building have come from many corners of the world, thus illustrating the interdependence of nations. The engineering school had a special part in the construction of the building. The balcony railings, the sash pulleys, and the radiator taps are genuine Robert College products having been made in the engineering shops. Professor Lynn Scipio, Dean of the Engineering School, designed the heating system, and Mr. Sarkis Kurjian the steel structure. Thus, the library is the first college building which the graduates of the engineering school have helped to construct. End quote. Next, please. So whereas technology had been the justification for the 19th century project of missionary education, in NECA's 20th century iteration, technology became the value to be inculcated, and US values and ways of life were the standard that needed to be reproduced. In other words, if the colonial seminary was the seedbed for missionaries and evangelical expansion, NECA's campuses were now the seedbed for a renewed liberal gospel of technology and industrial capitalism. And the students, the seeds, would continue to plant the so-called deserts around them long after leaving the campus. The parable of the Good Shepherd, that they may have life and have it more abundantly, which is used for the motto at the American University of Beirut still today, illustrated this dual function of the campus, both as an enclosure and as a gateway, a site for the transformation of local students into a native ministry for the gospel of economic goodwill. The so-called Good Shepherd, which this quote is meant to represent, was the United States, acting through the American teachers and staff of these colleges as a guardian of the Near East's growth and renovation. Next, please. As framed by one evangelical preacher of the early 20th century, John Calvin, just as Christ made the aging Roman Empire young again, so we have seen a change come upon ancient lands in our own time. They were growing decrepit in their extreme old age, and now they are turning young, manifesting the new spirit of enterprise, the new powers of adaptation, imagination, and ingenuity that are characteristic of youth, and setting forth on great national careers, not like decaying empires, but like little children. End quote. So in these ancient lands of the Fertile Crescent and the birthplace of Western religion and civilization, Near Eastern men were being trained not to go out as agential leaders into their own newly independent nations, but as young children in a new American empire that would perpetually rely on the support and paternal teaching of their American fathers, and through absorbing US values and knowledge, remain committed consumers of US goods, technology, and more. Next, please. Ultimately, however, these campuses were not sites for the salvation or rehabilitation of the Near East, but rather for America's rehearsal of its own. Each campus represented renewed challenges for NECA to overcome, a continual reenactment of the myth of punitive exodus preceding abundant life. Each campus was a site in which the myth of US moral superiority and material abundance, as articulated through changing models of education, was continually reenacted and refined. Together, these campuses constituted enduring laboratories for the myth of US goodwill and democracy, a myth that would fully take shape as a liberal developmental project after World War II. And today, while the US's educational and developmental project of international goodwill has definitely failed to be replaced by unmediated physical violence founded on technological supremacy, the evangelical myth of exodus and salvation remains at the heart of America's moral material role in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much to Chia for the invitation. Thank you to Spyros for being here. I'm excited to share this work with you. It's somewhat new. And the title is, and thank you to Elsa and Michelle for all their help as well. Okay, so the title is The Sleeping Giant and the Metamorphic Veil, 8 stories about the Gunflint Iron Formation, and this is story number 7. This story begins and ends in a front yard in Thunder Bay, Ontario, which was hit by a meteor 1.85 billion years ago. Here, at the top of what geologists call the Gunflint Iron Formation, stromatolites thick as cabbages cluster above a foot of anchorite. A clean shear shaves off their tops, over which a hodgepodge of underlying rock that was ripped up and hurled at speed is muddled with deformed spherulites and devitrified fragments. Geologist Phil Fralick wipes his hands on his jeans and kneels stiffly to rehearse the outcrop at our feet. Had you been standing here 13 seconds after the meteorite hit, he explains, a fireball hot enough to cause third-degree burns would have radiated outward, followed 2 minutes later by an earthquake whose energy release was 126 times stronger than the 1960 southern Chile earthquake, which was the largest instrumentally recorded earthquake on record. The ejecta would have rained down 8 minutes later, and what little was left alive would have been washed away by a tsunami that barreled in an hour later. If you look at the stratigraphy directly above the impact layer, there aren't any fossils there, because as living things died off, the planet's chemistry was driven back to Archean conditions, from which it took millions of years to recover. Fralick prods delicately at the laminae of 2 particularly magnificent stromatolites. He says, the blast cloud would have been going, about 800 kilometers an hour, and it picked up all the debris that was just weathered stuff on the surface and it moved it around. This hugely fast blast cloud came through and just picked it up. These here, he points, are like little hailstones, except they're made out of molten dust in the blast cloud. The blast cloud would have been about 700 centigrade, so it was really hot. And he pauses here to mop at his brow with a white handkerchief, as if still feeling some radiance off the blast. and then size. Anyhow, mind you don't trample the begonias. It is some kind of absurd miracle to see all this, a finely recorded apocalyptic day in planetary history, bedded beside begonias. Number 6. Early in the summer of 1953, Stan Tyler, a mineralogist at the University of Wisconsin, discovered something while trout fishing in Lake Superior on a day off from prospecting iron ore beds for a U.S. steel company. The gunflint outcrop he spied from his canoe was thick with stromatolites interspersed with black chert. Stromatolites are sort of like ancient fossilized coral reefs if microbes rather than coral animals had built them. It was geological common sense at that time that there were no fossils older than the Cambrian explosion, which happened about 561 million years ago. But these outcrops were, by Tyler's reckoning, nearly 4 times older than that, around 1.9 billion years old. So what sort of life could have been preserved here, and how? Under the microscope, Tyler found structurally well-preserved, microscopic, lifelike forms, possibly blue-green algae, providing, in Tyler's words, a glimpse through the Precambrian metamorphic veil. In June, Tyler sent dozens of slides to Harvard paleontologist Elso Barghorn. Tentatively classifying the fossils as morphologically similar to extant species, such as Lyngbia and Discoaster, Barghorn reflected, and this is a quote, "To study the morphology of extinct life at the Precambrian level of development is something I had never thought I would be privileged to do." In 1954, Tyler and Barghorn announced in the pages of Science that they had discovered Precambrian primitive lower plants, which is what we would now call cyanobacteria. Before the gunflint, paleontologists had only dealt with relatively recent and big fossils, sleeping giants like dinosaurs, ferns, and trilobites. But the mid-century discovery of Precambrian microfossils in the Gunflint Iron Formation on the northern shores of Lake Superior extended paleontology deeper into the Precambrian and even Archean eons, quadrupling the length of the known fossil record. For the first time, the geological community universally endorsed the existence of Precambrian fossilized biota. This was a sea change. Scientists learned that much, much older life, ancient, ancestral, perhaps even originary, was thickly salted beneath our feet, much of it invisible to the unaided eye. Number 5. On Skull Rock, at the southernmost tip of the sleeping giant, runs a vein of native silver, which a party of prospectors discovered in 1868. The quickly erected town of Silver Island Landing soon boasted 100 white pine homes, a Catholic and Methodist church, a blacksmith, carpenter, hotel, library, and steam yacht. While the land was rich in silver, the mine was treacherous. Fierce storms buffeted the mine's box cribs and cofferdams, washing them out as quickly as men could build them. By November 1884, a shaft dug more than 1,300 feet below the lake's surface required pumps to draw off the rising water. That winter, the commander of a ship carrying coal from Duluth to Silver Islet got drunk, steering his ship off course and wedging it in pack ice, where it was immovable until spring. Without the coal, the great engines stopped, and Lake Superior inundated the mine. During those same years, iron was being prospected in the Mesabi Range, which is continuous with the Gunflint 400 kilometers northeast. As early as the 1910s, however, politicians began voicing their concerns that American iron might be exhausted within a few decades' time. Those worries only grew after World War II, during which the Mesabi Range contributed 2/3 of the US military's iron ore. All those bullets and barbed wire and tanks were gouged out of open pit mines along 100 miles of Precambrian rock just north of Duluth. At the end of the war, steel corporations began hiring economic geologists, to seek out new sources of low-grade ore, including taconite. One mining company's 1954 newspaper ad put it like this, and you can see behind me, taconite, the sleeping giant, waking the giant, making practical use of Minnesota's multi-billion ton taconite supply, is a job that can keep iron ranges working for generations. So the sleeping giant mentioned in this advertisement references the Ojibwe name for Minnesota's Mesabi Range, which means giant mountain in Anishinaabe, with taconite here figured as the low-grade commercial stimulant that might jog the sleepy iron range out of its post-war torpor. 4. Dreaming that copper, iron, and silver would drive its economy into a prosperous future, the far-flung new province of Canada established the Canadian Geological Survey in 1842. Its prime directive was prospecting, in which capacity geologists sought mineral resources that could speed Canada into the Victorian industrial age. After 3 years of mineral prospecting, Canada claimed Anishinaabe land on October 10, 1845. Within a year, 160 applications for mineral exploration licenses were filed, of which 46 were granted for Lake Superior's North Shore. Shingle had been head chief of the Ojibwe of the Northern Great Lakes for 9 years when Canada extended its jurisdiction to the North Shore of Lake Superior, dispossessing First Nations of their ancestral land. Now, Shingle had long guided prospectors to metal outcrops with the understanding that the Ojibwe would then benefit from the proceeds of any subsequent mining. Incensed to find that prospectors were instead staking territorial claims over native land, Shingle traveled to Montreal to meet with the Governor General of Canada, demanding that his people be compensated. And you can't see the text, but I'll read it to you. He said, "The Great Spirit, in his beneficence, foreseeing that this time would arrive when the subsistence which the forests and the lakes afforded would fail, placed these mines in our lands, so that the coming generations of his red children might find thereby the means of subsistence. Assist us then to carry out this object of the Great Spirit." When it became clear that his demands would not be honored, Shingle led an expedition of 30 Anishinaabe by schooner up Lake Superior to the Mica Bay copper mine. The party woke the mine manager at 4 a.m., took control of the mine, and closed it down the following day. This incident forced the government to negotiate with the Ojibwe. And in 1850, Ojibwe chiefs and the Crown together signed the Robinson Treaties, which allowed Canada to continue mining, stipulating that Indigenous peoples would retain hunting and fishing rights, an annuity, and a reservation. Okay, number 3. Louis Agassiz arrived on Lake Superior with a phalanx of scientists in summer 1849 in hopes of discovering evidence for his theory of global ice ages. For Agassiz, who would reject Darwinian theory up until his death 24 years later, the living world was static. God had created all species and all human races and placed them in their current habitats. The fossil record thus posed a problem for him: how to account for evidence of extinct species. His solution was ice ages, during which glaciers, which he liked to call God's great plow, wiped the earth clean. Now, while he had ample glaciers to study in his native Switzerland, Agassiz now sought in the rocks of the New World similar evidence to buttress his theory, and by extension to demonstrate that Black and Indigenous people were separate creations, that the Garden of Eden was only for Caucasians, and that other races had their own untold creation stories. His party traveled in one Mackinac boat and 3 birch bark canoes that were crewed by Ojibwe voyageurs. J. Elliott Cabot wrote the narrative of Agassiz's fieldwork, in which he complained about swarming black flies, perpetual rain, and the digestive hazards of salt pork. Agassiz, though, triumphantly found geological evidence in support of his theory. Everywhere he looked, there were striated pavements, drop stones, and moraines. On July 5th, he interpreted an outcrop near Mica Bay, where Shingle Khan's would in 4 months' time seize a copper mine, to be, quote, proof positive of the correctness of my glacial theory. And as the party approached Thunder Bay, Cabot noted a strangely shaped promontory. He wrote in his journal, at a distance to the northward were 2 twin hills, called by the Indians the Knees. One could easily fancy the rest of the gigantic body lying at ease on the plateau, with the head to the north, and the knees drawn up in quiet contemplation of the sky. So perhaps Cabot had been hearing creation stories told by native guides, or perhaps, like his benefactor, he had in mind the creation of all things after a glacier furrowed the earth, when he said that this outcrop was, perhaps Nanabiju, the first man. 2. The sleeping giant is Nanabiju. Nanabiju formed Lake Superior. Here's one version of this story. Nanabiju walked all over the earth, measuring everything with his string. He decided on the lengths of rivers, on the size and depths of the lakes, and on the height of the hills and mountains. When this was done, he walked once more over the earth, searching for the perfect place to make his greatest lake. When he found this place, not too far north, not too far south, forest on one side and prairie on the other, he made his great lake. Nanabiju's noisy footprints created massive valleys and rock faces, cut from the granite and the slate that surrounded the water. Now, Nanabiju knew that these rocks harbored silver, but told only the Ojibwe where to find it, making them promise never to disclose its location. The Sioux were jealous of the Ojibwe's silver and sent people to torture them, but they refused to reveal Nanabiju's secret. The Sioux next sent a man disguised as an Ojibwe, who befriended the Ojibwe and learned where their silver was. Captured by white men, the Sioux tried to negotiate his freedom with a piece of silver. And when the white men got him drunk, he told them where the silver could be found. In his grief, Nanabiju lay down to sleep upon the water. His shape is now a rock too. But he's not just a memory or a lesson, for the people say that one day soon he will awake. When he does, and steps onto the land, his head touching the sky, Nanabiju will take back this world and banish the invaders who were able to strip the earth, because they never really learned to see this place or listen to it. And that's all a quote from an indigenous story. Nanabiju's story continues to animate geological expeditions and mineral prospecting on Lake Superior. It is there in the apocalypse found in a front yard. It is there when the oldest fossils are spied while trout fishing in a canoe, when a ship hauling coal founders on pack ice, causing the lake to swallow a silver mine, when Shingle Khan's captures a copper mine to force the province of Canada to recognize Ojibwe sovereignty, and when a Swiss creationist found himself suddenly face to face with the first man. 1. Continental ice shelves advanced and then retreated 4 times during the Quaternary, sculpting out the interior basin of Lake Superior. During the last of these glacial periods, a 2-kilometer high lobe of the Laurentide ice sheet, called the Keewatin Ice Dome, drove across the Canadian Shield, compressing the ground beneath it, and then withdrew, slowly melting into pro-glacial Lake Agassiz, an inland body of water that was larger than the Caspian Sea. As the ice sheets melted 11,000 years ago, they drained into Lake Superior's predecessor. Unweighted by the heavy pack ice, the ground beneath the north shore of Lake Superior rebounded. It bobs upward to this day, up to 0.5 centimeter every year, depending on which side of the shore you're standing on. Before that, while the glaciers were still retreating, hunter-gatherers began mining the copper deposits that had sluiced through Gabbro out onto the land. By the time Europeans began exploring Lake Superior, the land had long been occupied by Anishinaabe peoples, who had arrived here at the end of their 500-year migration. Before that, around 1.1 billion years ago, Laurentia tried to tear itself in 2, leaving a scar stretching from Ontario to Kansas. Lava split open a thinly stretched mantle of Proterozoic dolostone, coursing into the Rift Valley, hundreds of volcanic eruptions encasing bedrock beneath fresh waves of basalt. Superheated water trapped under the rock vented upward, leaching minerals and precipitating copper and iron and silver into narrow fissures and veins. These metals would much later prove valuable. But for reasons not yet fully understood, the rift was imperfect, which is why Minneapolis and Milwaukee aren't today separated by an ocean. Before that, a comet crashed to Earth 650 kilometers to the east, puncturing the crust, triggering earthquakes and tsunamis that tore up microbial mass as vaporized rock and shocked quartz rained down. It annihilated organisms that had established themselves in an ocean flooding Minnesota and Ontario. Their fossils have been left exposed to the sun in someone's front yard, just beside the begonias. So all of these stories are gunflint, but which of these stories is gunflint? How can you tell one story of a place if that place has existed for billions of years? Places like the gunflint are congested with stories. The landscape is chock-a-block and heaped up with narrative, overwhelmed by an excess of significance. One cannot tell a history of the gunflint that starts at the beginning and just keeps going. I've tried. It simply would not work because the everyday and the historical and the prehistoric and the geological and the mythic are all jumbled up together tooth by jowl. That's of course true of lots of places when you pay attention. The gunflint is a place that has pulled itself together in the thick of things that happened and could have happened otherwise. It has taken shape at the juncture of phenomena in which geological processes seed without ever determining various ways of being on, working with, taking from, and knowing about land. The gunflint is contoured by long histories in which geological phenomena have conditioned economic enterprise, extraction and despoliation, human migration, local storytelling, territorial expansion, appropriation, dispossession, national imaginaries, promises of mineral abundance, and scientific discoveries that then in turn offer their own ways of making sense of and recounting local and planetary histories. Excessive, crowded places with their surfeits of stories mean different things to different people. A trickster creation story is not a glimpse through the Precambrian metamorphic veil, is not a fortune made in steel, is not proof positive of a glacial theory. But all of these stories, even as they transpire at radically different paces, 100 million year mountain orogeny, a broken promise between Nanabiju and the Ojibwe, a chance comet impact on a Tuesday 1.85 billion years ago, a silver mine forfeited to a lake on Christmas, a serendipitous discovery while trout fishing, a receding horizon of iron reserves, a Swiss creationist looking for God's plow, accrete, superpose, and cross-cut one another, even as they get faulted and folded over time.
Spyros,
thank you, Lucia, for asking me to respond to these two brilliant and very different papers. It's not an easy task, but I'll do my best. The two brilliant papers we just heard are based on two contrasting natural models of abundance. The one vegetal, the other mineral. The first describing the building of American university campuses in the Near East era as a garden in the midst of wilderness, the other narrating the mining of silver in rock formations close to Lake Superior in between Canada and the United States. Both papers offer a picture of abundance that oscillates between growth and depletion, expansion and extinction. Histories, or rather stories of creation, that at least in Sophia's stories are punctuated by a sudden primeval catastrophe, or an impeding modern and much slower destruction and depletion of these resources, equal though in its tectonic capacity to the emergence of American campuses on the other side of the Atlantic, narrated in Yasmina's paper. Both papers evolve around a building metaphor, or more literally, the building of a metaphor. In Yasmina's case, the theological metaphor of the garden, which, as she describes, is materialized by the building of the American University in Near Eastern territory. In Sophia's case, it's a creation story that turns into the metaphor of the sleeping giant, the rock formation hiding silver mineral deposits that is rebuilt, destroyed, and reawakened once again by anthropogenic mineral activity. Inside these stories of vegetal and mineral growth, there is abundance of contested human presence, pitting a group of human invaders into ancestral and indigenous territories, the first in the ancient lands of Greece, Balkans, and the Near East, the other in North America. Yet both papers demonstrate how human agency is inextricably entwined with these vegetal and mineral formations, as for example when, in Yasmina's paper, refugee students turned into farming refugees educated in the field of agriculture, or more assertively, more affluent students in the Near East era are asked by none other than the Rockefellers, who found these universities, to participate in the building construction of these garden campuses, by building the very university structures that in return build them as educated, civilized humans in a vegetal cycle of reciprocal formation, or what in German called Bildung. In Sophia's paper, the growth of human unbuilding via the means of geoprospecting and mineral extraction is momentously suspended by the obliteration or radical derangement of human activity by chemical agents, namely alcohol. When a drunk commander of a ship carrying coal steered his vessel off course and wedging it into pack ice, as Sophia says, which was impossible to move, leading to the cessation of engine activity in the mine and its inundation by lake water. Intoxication reappears in Sophia's story when, quote, white men deliberately intoxicate the Sioux, disguised as an Ojibwa man, to extract from him the secret of the location of silver mineral deposits in the mountain, which sets off the cycle of human exploitation of minerals and instigates the sleeping as well as future reawakening of the rock god giant, in whose very knees the human mind is sculpted. Stories of personification and the anthropomorphism of physical elements turn into myths of mineralization and building development in Yasmina's paper, when she quotes the rhetoric of university officials juxtaposing, quote, the building of a brick barn as a demonstration of achievement in the masonry department with, quote, the bright faces of our boys, showing their purpose and ability to accomplish things, end quote. Which means that the economic value of the brick facade and the educational edifice it encloses is now mirrored on the faces of the future citizens who will further build and cultivate the same land, transforming it into a construction site. The two papers then also offer a contrasting model of siting, the place setting of human as well as vegetal and mineral activity, including building and mining activity. Yasmina's in the multiplication of transplanted American campuses in Europe and the Near East, and sites from Sofia to Athens to Smyrna to Beirut, creating a portable method of building institution, whose proliferation creates a mirage of building abundance. In Sophia's case, the site appears to be less movable, at least on a horizontal level, concentrating activity around the bends and mountains of a vast territory of Lake Superior, known as the largest lake in the world. Yet this vast site itself is replete by vertical movement, not only in the trajectory of silver mining, but also the vast geological movement, namely the volcanic eruptions that cause the scar stretching from Ontario to Kansas, filling the Rift Valley with lava and encasing the rock with fresh waves of basalt, end quote. The two papers also then create a contrast in terms of the epistemological disciplines or scenarios they are recruiting. Yasmina's paper is obviously about the building of knowledge in modern universities alongside modern capital, yet also alongside the auspices and pliable metaphorologies of Christian theology that keeps preaching the myth of material and civilization abundance. In Sophia's case, it's the modern science of geology that evolves alongside earth extraction, but also juxtaposed with indigenous epistemologies and creation stories. Tellingly, the only mention of a garden in Sophia's paper, as opposed to the dozens of times we hear about it in Yasmina's paper, is in reference to the work of the 19th century anthropologist and geologist Louis Agassiz, who moved from his native Switzerland to the New World in order to prove his racist theory that the Garden of Eden was only for Caucasians and that other races like Black and indigenous peoples had their own untold creation stories, end quote. The primeval and or modern garden here turns from a site of phenomenal inclusion to that of evident exclusion, a site of segregation consolidated in quasi-scientific myths of racial hierarchy and inequitable distribution on the globe. Keeping in mind this series of diagonal correspondences among these two papers on abundance, I conclude with a note on their temporal aspects that organically or chemically and inorganically amalgamate the past or the deep past with either an immediate or an unpredictably distant future. That is the moment when theology turns not only into an instrumentalized teleology, whose economic ends become explicit in both papers, but also an apocalyptic eschatology, materializing on the first page of Sophia's paper with the falling of a meteor in North America 1.85 billion years ago, and setting in motion the geological movement that leads to the creation of both mining and the science of geology in the 19th century and beyond. A more furtive but equally apocalyptic trace can be found in the brief yet momentous references of both papers to war and military technologies being either, quote, the spiritual warfare that American universities aim to supply their students, and the acclimatizing of university establishments into post-war conditions in Yasmina's paper, but also in Sophia's paper, when we learned that after World War II, the Mesabi Range contributed 2/3 of the US military iron ore, bullets and barbed wire and tanks gouged off open pit mines along 100 miles of Precambrian rock, end quote. After listening to both papers, one longs for the day when American universities will re-emerge in future archaeological sites as prehistoric fossils, transfiguring the vegetal patterns of material abundance into mineral remnants of suspended growth. You're finished. Because I have to also put some questions,
Yes,
right?
please put some questions. Everybody take your position for how you'd like to be fossilized.
Sure, no, I can do it. I think both myself, but I believe the rest of the audience is dying to hear more about your projects. The larger picture from which you extracted this piece, right? But in doing so, you're not going to give us the whole book, obviously, both of you.
Well, how much time do you have?
All right. But I wanted you, if possible, to focus on three things. Basically, the parallel between knowledge production and material production that both of your papers obviously do. And that is the proliferation of scientific disciplines alongside material prospecting, such as geology, mineral example, or agricultural production in Yasmina's case. Second is about the very nature of these sightings, right? The spatial situations you describe in terms of this setting, which seems to be, especially in Yasmina, portable and reproducible from one side to the next among these university campuses. But also in your case, I find something very interesting happening in the siting of the mineral activity, the geological and the mining one, versus the more nomadic one of hunting and fishing that happens in the same sites by the indigenous people. So these are very broad questions.
Maybe Yasmina
Should
should
use some
start.
first.
Yeah. And just so you know, if you want to talk to Yasmina, you can see that in that camera. Do you want to start, Yasmina?
Sure. I think I missed the third question, but the two are meaty enough that I can answer. Thank you so much, first of all, for the commentary, which I really enjoyed listening to. I guess, maybe actually just talking a bit about the larger project starts to answer some of the questions, or both the questions. So the way I started looking at this project was more as I was interested in the way that the Americans grouped these sites together, actually. I was interested in why they chose these 5 countries that we don't really think of as the Near East today, and in how, by choosing these sites, it was kind of showing that there was a post-Ottoman kind of thinking that was taking place. So at the end of the First World War, trying to claim a Near East that wasn't what the French or the British had done, right? Because they divided the post-Ottoman lands in very different ways. And so I was kind of thinking about it more on this geopolitical dimension. And I think, to start from the second question, in some ways, yes, I'm interested in the way that they reproduce these things in each of the sites, because it shows that they are thinking about this as a regional project and as one connected region, and they're trying to actually make it into, or they're trying to fabricate a story, right, which has to do with the Ottoman precedent and how this now becomes a new region of US influence. But at the same time, what I'm also really interested in, and I try to do a bit in this paper, is to show how this reshaping of these new nations is still part of a construction of a larger civilizational story in which each of these sites has a specific role to play, right? So, Istanbul, which was the capital of the Ottoman Empire, is treated very differently than Athens, treated very differently from Bulgaria. I mean, obviously, I just gave very short vignettes here, but Athens also becomes really important for them because it is the root of so-called, Western democracy, and it is treated very differently eventually in the way that they conceptualize these campuses. Of course, it's all fabricated, I mean, as you said in your commentary, but I'm interested in seeing how these fabrications tell us about how they are envisioning these different sites. And in terms of the first question about knowledge production and material production, I guess what I'm really interested in doing in this project, but also in my previous project, which was about the 19th century, is to show how the kind of intellectual and material have always been intertwined in US constructions of superiority and empire in a way. And so how it's a continuous kind of loop between this notion that the fact that they have this superior technology that they've managed to establish early on in the 19th century propels their own narratives of being the chosen ones that are meant to go renovate the world. And then the more they build and the more they spread, the more these narratives are reinforced. So I'm kind of interested in the interaction between these two things, right? And that's kind of what I'm trying to show as well. Yeah.
There wasn't a third question. These were the two. Sorry.
Okay.
Great, Sophia, do you want to?
Yeah. So I'll start by answering the first question about knowledge production and material production. I'll say that, so naively, when I started writing this book, I didn't want to talk about extraction. And I could not, because every time I went to a new field site, like I went to Oman and I had to get security detail from the Petroleum Development of Oman, right, which was run by the Sultan. And when I went to Australia, there were uranium mines on the same field site that I was working. And I went to Turks and Caicos and there were Chevron scientists at our field. So it was like I had to, at some point, grapple with it. Stubbornly, I didn't want to. But what I've ended up thinking about the relationship between geology and particularly academic geology and these histories, long histories of extraction, whether it's silver, cobalt, uranium, petroleum, etc., is that it's not just the infrastructure that brings geologists to these sites. What I've kind of landed on in thinking about this, and this begins to answer your second question as well, is the question I'm trying to respond to is sort of every geological field site has good rocks. Not every good rock becomes a geological field site. I've had scientists tell me that like the most amazing outcrop they ever saw was behind a target in New Haven, right? Like that's not a geological field site, but these other places are. So what has to happen to make a site for geological study? It's extraction. Because you need the maps and the highways and the places to spend the night and lots of other things as well, including published papers, topos, things like that. So, but beyond that, I think it's not merely the infrastructure. It's not just the maps and the highways. It's also the way in which the extractive industries reason about land and terrain and territory ends up powerfully shaping the epistemic content of the geological sciences. So there are ways of reasoning in geology that I think are deeply indebted to extraction, right? And so one is never really very far from the other. And maybe continuing on this question of sites and what makes a geological field site a geological field site is, I was also oftentimes in the field grappling with the fact that I'm an anthropologist, so I'm trained as a field worker. Geologists are also trained as field workers, and there's all sorts of nasty colonial baggage that comes along with that. And I was thinking about the fact that when I'm at a site, right, I'm at a field site, they're at a field site, we're actually in the same place, but our field sites are not the same. They're coincidental. And so there's a long tradition in anthropology of being able to say field sites don't just happen. They have to come about because of lots of other stuff that has happened in the past, some of which is obviously about empire, but other things as well, right? I mean, Gupta and Ferguson wrote about this substantially back in the 90s, right? So anthropologists know this. The thing that I found surprising was that geological field sites are also shaped by these long histories of different kinds of transnational relations of power and questions of political economy. So that's something that I'm trying to make really apparent throughout the book.
Right.
Great, thank you.
Fantastic. Before we go to the room, just really quickly, and I guess you can hear me, right, Yasmina? You can hear it's very interesting what you were saying about the coincidental sites.
Mm-hmm.
In both papers, there's really an attempt to make coincidence go away. Right? Like the creationists just don't want it to be a coincidence that certain people end up in different places, and that's why glacial theory is helpful, because it's a big catastrophe, clean them. And in your case, you also have these scientists who, what's amazing about the first story you told, the first begonia story, is that you hear such precision and you can hear the satisfaction he has to tell you exactly what happened and if it could have been otherwise, and you write that these things could have been otherwise. And so, but ultimately science gives, again, the satisfaction of knowing, of causation, etc. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more, both of you, about this question of trying to get rid of any causation that's not just purely accidental.
Who's trying to get rid of it?
Oh, sorry, that's the satisfaction, the alliance between myths that need a reason for things, such as myths of deities, and the alliance with that with science, which paradoxically you would think would be able to explain all manners of things, but in the end science helps to explain those things that are otherwise completely random. Why did a rock fall? Was it because of a god? No, this one I can tell you exactly which did. So it's a weird alliance between things that would be completely mythical and something that's highly explainable, but because it's a science that explains very distant events that you wouldn't otherwise be able to understand, it has a revelatory aspect to it. Maybe my question doesn't have, maybe my question is more of a comment. I don't know. Let me know if you have any.
Yasmina, do you want to go first on that one?
That's not fair that I always have to go first.
I don't know.
I can do it.
Go ahead.
No, I'm kidding. I actually think it does make sense. I don't really have a very well-formulated answer. I'll take it more as a comment, but I do think that there is a tension, at least in my paper, between obviously these eschatological millenarian narratives and the way that in the 20th century the project becomes essentially about science, right? And there's this ongoing tension between how does this religious project become more and more liberal and more secular over time.
Yeah, great.
I guess that's kind of what you're
Yes.
yeah.
Much more succinctly put. Thank you.
Yeah, so I thought a lot about coincidence in writing this chapter, the chapter on which this paper is based. And it felt to me like there's a moment of coincidence in each of the stories that I tell, except for Agassiz, because Agassiz, he has to go to Lake Superior to prove this, excuse my language, batshit theory.
Right.
And so like, and in order to prove this theory, which is racist, he has to be at the mercy of indigenous voyageurs who are carting him around. And so I think that, it's not, I wouldn't call it an insight, but that thought made me feel like part of the story of the Gunflint is it's not just about scale, but it's sort of about how the geological and its power to talk about these big things, creation and destruction and apocalypse and catastrophe, ends up being a way of telling lots of different kinds of stories about how things came to be.
Great.
Yeah.
That's good. Ehab and Matt, go ahead.
All right, thank you, great,
You have
so
to
much.
speak up so Yasmina can
All
hear.
right, thank you so much. This was fantastic, both talks. My question is probably a bit of an extension of your question and comment. She's like, the sort of strive for a discursive coherence in the case of, you have a sort of a clash between science and religion. You could go and be like, religion is right, we don't care about what science says. The other way is right too. But he was saying, no, actually, if you look really well, what science is saying is exactly what religion is saying. And this strive for coherence is a very 19th century thing, is what fascinates me about this. And I'm curious about the historical coherence, or the historical metaphor, and how coherent they want to make it. And my question is for Yasmina, essentially, about the American narrative, the historical narrative, about the Near East. What did the American imagine the Near East to be? There are two elements here. The first one, you sort of mentioned it, and I'm very curious about it, if you could say more about it, which is Greece. The birth of Western civilization that is now an Eastern land because of the Ottoman presence. And this wasn't really the opinion of the British and the French for various reasons. The Americans had a very different colonial enterprise. So starting from Rome worked better, I guess, for the Americans than starting from Greece. The second elephant in the room, I guess, is Islam. And here's why I found it funny, because the French, when they built their schools, the Père Blanc in North Africa, they found a solution. They called the Arab parenthesis. They said it started, it was over, and the Arabs brought nothing. They just gave us what happened, basically the knowledge of the ancients. They transmitted it to us. What did the Americans say? Because with the desert thing, there's also seems to be an anthropological desert. There's no mention at all of who is living there. While when we talk about science, there's one quote that's like beautiful. It's like bringing science and education and religion. And there's math in it, and this is what the part I looked at. Of course, we were talking about Euclid and Ptolemy, who lived in Alexandria, but I'm sure they're also referencing the Muslim scientists of the region as well, without naming them. How do they manage to create a historical coherence when Greece is in the East and the Muslim world doesn't exist in the Muslim world?
Okay, small question.
Thank you for the question. It touches on a lot of things that are actually there in the project. I obviously don't have time to talk about them in such a short paper. I think that, what you're talking about is this narrative, right? That the Americans are constructing. And to go back to what I just answered a few minutes ago, the narrative, because there's this tension between all these different things that that you mentioned, which is the actual history of the region, the fact that there was an Arab civilization, and the fact that actually Christianity comes from this region, right? The Americans are seeing themselves as the inheritors of Christian civilization. And in their story, this civilization has traveled, right? It's traveled from the ancient Near East through Europe to America, and they've perfected it. But because of these tensions and the fact that actually they're not coherent stories, the Americans have to constantly redo the stories. They have to constantly reframe them. They have to constantly refine them. And so the story is constantly changing. So my first book is actually about the early 19th century and about the missionaries when they're actually missionaries. And the story back then is very different. So when there's still an Ottoman Empire and they're kind of still very much interested in Palestine and Syria and not really at this Near Eastern broader project, the framing of the narrative is that the Arabs are different from the Turks, right? So the Arabs are the inheritors of this superior civilization, and Islam has kind of ruined the potential, but the Turks are the despots, right? And then obviously in the beginning of the 20th century, the narrative has to change because that's no longer the situation. But there isn't one fixed narrative that they're holding on to, except the fact that they are the inheritors, right? That they are the future. So the past narrative can constantly change. The fact that they are the future is the only part that doesn't change. And then within that also, like, what are the tools that they're using for this future, right? This is what is also kind of changing. I think that's my short answer because it's a very dense question.
Matt and Hannah. Back there. Go ahead.
Thank you all so much. This
You have
question
to speak.
Sorry, yeah, I'm always a mumbler.
You
Thank
could
you.
stand up to that.
Okay. Thank you all so much. This question is primarily for Sophia, but I imagine it could also play for Yasmina as well. I'm curious about the relationship between land and meaning, I guess, in your projects, because I mean, in particular in Sophia's project, given the form of these episodes, you sort of create a situation in which various facts from the territory are sort of brought into a narrative, included and excluded depending on which narrative you have. So I'm curious if you thought between all of those different narratives, which seem also to sort of unsettle the primacy of any particular one, if you could say more about whatever you've come to realize about the way that people make meaning from the physical facts of topography. Because it's clear that this formation resonates across all of these different and sometimes contradictory narrations. But I was sort of curious if you thought more about maybe the mechanism by which you see that occurring across your various examples.
Can I add my
Yes,
question?
please.
Yeah, I had a sort of similar question about the role of metaphor as a mode of reasoning, because it's always like, this formation is like this thing and this is this. And I was gonna ask if that comes from the extractive logic that you were talking about, or if that's something different, but I think that actually maybe it relates more closely to what Matt is asking about.
You mean if metaphor comes from extraction?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
That would be great.
Let's hear it.
I'm writing it down.
Okay, so land and meaning, the like $10 term that I've started using to describe this is stratified ontology, because I'm thinking about it as stratigraphy, and I think there are ways that ontologies do laminate and stratify over one another, right? In a way that doesn't make it linear. Anyone who's hung out at an outcrop knows that like stratigraphy actually can fold and fault and get all twisted up and do weird things. And so there are, like I said at the conclusion of the talk, right, there are all these different ways of thinking about the same place. I don't want to do the kind of like Anne-Marie Moll multiple ontology thing, because I think that's not quite what I'm describing in this case. But I do think there's a way in which the land ends up kind of condensing lots of different ways of talking about it. And some of that actually has to do with physical topography. So there are, in another story that I tell about Australia, there are a series of indigenous creation stories, and there's also paleontological work. And the thing that I kept fighting against was they sound a lot alike, and I was like, I'm not doing proto-science. I refuse to think about this as proto-science. But it's actually like, if enough people hang out in the same place for long enough, the land conditions the way they talk about it and the way they make sense of it. With regard to metaphor is not coming from extractive industries, but analogy does, actually, because petroleum scientists do what they call proxy reasoning, where they'll say, okay, we're going to go to this one place, but we're going to use it to think about what this other place was like 200 million years ago. So I gave Turks and Caicos as an example earlier. Turks and Caicos is a lot like what the Persian Gulf used to be. And so they go there to study petroleum formation, even though obviously there's no petroleum in Turks and Caicos, it's like 1,000 years old. So there's stuff like that, and they'll use these analogies between one place now and another place in the past, but also imagine the place they're in now in a future that will look like that other place now looks. Does that? Yeah.
We're ready for the American University to be fossilized.
Yes.
They'll extract from us. Yasmina, do you want to take a response too?
Sure. I mean, actually, it's an interesting question because I think it makes me realize that I have to admit that potentially I'm less material in the way that I'm looking at my material, like at my sites, and I'm much more leaning onto the storytelling and the kind of metaphorical and the discursive analysis. And so I guess I am kind of using the metaphor. And I think it's because, I mean, I also have to admit that it's very one-sided, the story that I'm telling. I mean, obviously, I'm constantly asked, where are the locals whenever I present my work? And it kind of like annoys me because I just feel like what Sophia said was so true. You can never really tell all the stories. You have to choose one story. And I've kind of chosen to tell the specific story, which is how the Americans see this land, how the Americans see this project, and potentially you can later on do another story. But I think the metaphor in that sense becomes like a dual thing, because for the Americans, so much of the project is a metaphor, right? Like they see the Near East as a metaphor, they see these millenarian narratives as metaphors. And for me, it becomes like a very good tool to tell the story as well, right? Because they are seeing the land as a metaphor. They're not actually seeing the land necessarily for its material characteristics. I mean, especially earlier in the 19th century, when the Holy Land is imagined almost without people, right? Because the whole point of the millenarian narrative is that they're going to go and reclaim it. And so whatever people are living on it is besides the point. And so they become really interested in the botanical, in the archaeological, etc. And so I guess, yeah, the metaphor is a very strong method for me, but also like a very strong discursive tool to both understand what the Americans are doing and also tell the story again.
Great. Fantastic. Yes, back there.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. Yasmina, I had a question about maybe the materiality of the building, what the building is doing to these people, in the sense that it was striking to me how similar this project was to the Carlisle schools, let's say in Pennsylvania, where indigenous people were brought after the Civil War, or the mental health institutes that were created all throughout this country to create structures that were supposed to heal people into a homogeneous American vision. And they too were also required to work in the gardens. So I wonder if these were things you also were thinking about.
Right. Go ahead, Yasmina.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you so much. It's a bit of a shame that I can't see who's asking the question.
I guess
But,
we could ask people to come stand.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's kind of related to my previous answer in a way where I think it's really hard to know what the building actually does to the students, right? Like affect, let's say. And I think I've kind of like coasted through these projects based on my own experience, because I went to these schools and I kind of like constantly recreate in my head the experience of having been there. But I think what is interesting to me and what I'm trying to show is what they thought that these buildings were doing to these students, right? And in terms of what you were saying, that exactly what is interesting to me is how it's kind of a universal project, right? So it's a kind of racial narrative, and it's deployed in the US in one way, and then it's deployed across the world in a very similar way, and only slightly tweaked to adapt to whatever site it's in. And it's constantly the story of, civilizational uplift or etc. And I think obviously it's very interesting to ask whether it works, I don't think that I'm able to answer that question. Or like, I can obviously answer it from my perspective, which is very personal. Like, do I think people in Lebanon have been impacted by the American University of Beirut? Of course they have, right? And of course we are like very much shaped by this education that we've received. But I don't think that architecture is necessarily the discipline that you like answer that question from, right?
Great. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Do you want to be the first to actually stand in front of the camera and
Should
ask a question? Yes, please, so that way she can see you. Sorry.
It's actually for Sophia, so I don't know if...
Oh, it's for Sophia.
Maybe I'll just
Okay.
Sorry. No, thank you both for like super inspiring presentations, really wonderful. Sophia, I was curious about sort of the contemporary cultural politics of these narratives that you have encountered, because sort of how you found these indigenous epistemologies and narratives that you have shared with us today. Because increasingly it feels like in sort of the global high north and especially in the Arctic maybe, indigenous knowledge is increasingly sort of challenging the hegemony of
these more sort of colonial explorer narratives about the region. So I'm curious if these were narratives you had shared in oral histories or that you read or things that are generally known now sort of broadly in the region.
Well, it depends because different chapters come from different field sites and different field sites have different indigenous peoples attached to them. So with regard to the contemporary politics, I obviously only use forward-facing stories in any of the chapters. In this one, the story of the sleeping giant is quite famous, so it's been published multiple times in multiple different versions, and there are also oral histories of indigenous elders telling that story, and so I pieced it together from those. In other sites, I often spoke to indigenous or aboriginal people who were on that land and asked, what are the stories about how this land came to be and why it is shaped the way it is, and collected those myself. But I'm very cognizant of the fact that there is an impulse. I think this was a critique that Zoe Todd made of Latour before he passed away, of Euro-American white academics drawing upon these stories and then decontextualizing them in order to talk about contemporary issues, specifically with regards to planetary climate change, things like that. And so what I've struggled to do is make sure that the stories that I tell, first of all, I share with the indigenous people who supplied them before I publish. And I also try to ensure that I'm doing it in a way that's contextually respectful.
What's forward-facing?
I don't use any secret stories.
No secret stories.
Yes.
So things that's already.
Yes.
And who tells you what's secret?
The people I ask.
And so, but they might share the story with you, and then you would be in on the secret, but then you don't write it. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
We are out of time, but it's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much to everybody, and thank you for coming.